What if everything you thought you knew about one of history's greatest civilizations was wrong? Picture a city so powerful it rivaled Rome, a culture so advanced it commanded the ancient Mediterranean, yet today, Carthage is shrouded in whispers, half-truths, and myths so strange they defy belief. This isn't just another forgotten empire, it's a place where legend bleeds into history, where even the most outrageous tales might hold a grain of truth. From child sacrifices to secret naval superweapons, the stories surrounding Carthage are as captivating as they are controversial, and that's exactly why we're here to unravel the mysteries, separate fact from fiction, and dive headfirst into the 25 most bizarre myths that have clung to this enigmatic civilization like shadows. Imagine a city built by exiles, rising from the ashes of defeat to become a titan of trade and war. Carthage wasn't just another ancient power, it was a phenomenon. At its peak, its merchants dominated the seas, its armies struck fear into the hearts of enemies, and its influence stretched from the coasts of North Africa to the rocky shores of Sicily. But here's the twist: history is written by the victors, and after Rome crushed Carthage in a series of brutal wars, much of its true story was erased, distorted, or buried beneath layers of propaganda. What remains is a puzzle, one where even the wildest myths might be hiding fragments of a lost reality. So why do these strange tales persist? Because Carthage represents more than just a fallen empire. It's a mirror reflecting our fascination with the unknown, the misunderstood, and the deliberately hidden. For centuries, historians and storytellers have twisted its legacy, turning it into everything from a cautionary tale to a boogeyman of the ancient world. But what if the truth is even stranger? Over the next minutes, we'll journey through the fog of time to examine the 25 most jaw-dropping myths about Carthage, stories that challenge what we think we know, stories that might just rewrite history. Buckle up, this isn't just a trip into the past, it's an excavation of the extraordinary. The most chilling legend of Carthage isn't about battles or betrayals, it's about what happened in the shadows of their temples. For centuries, the story persisted. Carthaginians sacrificed their own children to the god Baal, placing infants on the outstretched arms of a bronze statue before letting them tumble into flames below. Roman historians like Diodorus Siculus describe these rituals in graphic detail, painting Carthage as a land of unspeakable cruelty. But how much of this was fact, and how much was propaganda crafted by their greatest enemies? The answer might lie in a patch of scorched earth just outside ancient Carthage, a place called the Tophet. Archaeologists unearthed thousands of urns here, each containing the charred bones of young children and animals. At first glance, it seems to confirm the darkest rumors, yet modern science tells a more complicated story. Forensic analysis reveals many of these children died of natural causes before being cremated, suggesting the Tophet could have been a sacred cemetery for those lost too soon, not a site of ritual murder. Some scholars argue the animal bones mixed with human remains point to symbolic offerings, not wholesale slaughter. But why would Rome exaggerate or even invent such horrors? Because war isn't just fought on battlefields. By branding Carthaginians as baby killers, Rome justified their own brutality in the Punic Wars. It transformed a rival into a monster, making destruction seem like justice. Even today, the debate rages. Some experts point to Carthaginian inscriptions referencing malk, a term possibly linked to sacrifice, while others note similar accusations were hurled at early Christians and Jews by the same Roman writers. Here's what gets buried beneath the hype: Carthage wasn't some outlier. Infant mortality was staggeringly high in the ancient world, and cultures from Greece to Egypt practiced rituals that might seem shocking now. The difference: Carthage lost, and history, as always, is written by the victors. So next time you hear about Carthaginian child sacrifice, ask yourself, is this a fact or the ultimate smear campaign? Hannibal's march across the Alps with elephants is one of history's most vivid images, a daring general leading an army of towering beasts through snow and ice to strike at Rome itself. It's the ultimate underdog story, a feat so audacious it feels more like myth than military strategy, but how much of this legendary trek actually happened? Let's peel back the layers of exaggeration and propaganda to uncover the truth behind Carthage's most famous gamble. First, the numbers. Ancient historians like Polybius and Livy wrote that Hannibal set out with 37 elephants, a figure that's been repeated for centuries. But modern historians raise eyebrows at this. Elephants are notoriously difficult to transport, especially over mountains. They eat hundreds of pounds of food a day, suffer in cold climates, and are prone to panic on unstable terrain. Even if Hannibal had 37 at the start, how many survived the journey? Recent archaeological finds suggest the answer might be shocking. Along potential routes through the Alps, researchers discovered elephant bones, some showing signs of butchering. This hints that many of Hannibal's elephants may have been casualties of the brutal crossing, either dying from exposure or slaughtered for food by desperate soldiers. Then there's the route itself. For years, scholars debated whether Hannibal took the Col de Clapier, the Col du Mont-Cenis, or another pass entirely. Each has its flaws. Some are too narrow for elephants, others too high for the time of year. The truth, Hannibal likely chose the path of least resistance, adapting as conditions worsened. Elephants may have been more symbolic than practical living siege engines meant to terrify Roman allies, not just break their lines. Why does this myth endure? Because it encapsulates Carthage's reputation as the empire that dared the impossible. Rome framed Hannibal as a villain, but even they couldn't resist marveling at his audacity. The elephants weren't just weapons, they were propaganda. Every account of their icy march reinforced Carthage's image as a civilization that defied logic. In the end, whether Hannibal crossed with 3 elephants or 37 doesn't matter. What lingers is the legend itself, a story of ambition so bold it still takes our breath away. Carthage as a den of pirates, it's an image that's clung to the civilization like barnacles on a ship's hull. Ancient rivals, particularly the Romans, painted Carthaginians as sea-raiding villains, lurking in coves to plunder honest merchants. But was this reputation earned, or was it another calculated smear in a centuries-long propaganda war? The truth lies somewhere between the waves of exaggeration and the shores of reality. Start with the stereotype's origins. Carthage grew from Phoenician roots, and the Phoenicians themselves were legendary seafarers. To Greek and Roman writers, anyone who dominated the seas the way Carthage did must have been up to no good. The word pirate became shorthand for foreign trader we don't like. Rome especially had a habit of blurring the line between commerce and crime when it suited them. After all, calling your enemy a pirate makes it easier to justify sinking their ships or seizing their ports, yet archaeology tells a different story. Carthage wasn't some lawless pirate haven, it was the Wall Street of the ancient Mediterranean. Digs at Carthaginian harbors reveal meticulous dockyards, custom houses, and evidence of complex trade contracts etched in stone. They had standardized weights and measures, courts to settle merchant disputes, and even early forms of maritime insurance. This wasn't the behavior of thieves, it was the hallmark of a society built on trust and regulation. So why did the myth stick? Because piracy, like sacrifice, made for convenient wartime rhetoric. When Rome wanted to blockade Carthage or confiscate its goods, painting them as brigands gave moral cover. The irony, Rome itself relied on privateers and opportunistic raids when it suited them, but history rarely holds the victors to the same standard. The next time you hear Carthage described as a pirate empire, remember, the loudest voices in history often belong to those with something to gain. The image is cinematic: Hannibal's troops flinging clay pots onto enemy decks, shattering to release a writhing mass of venomous snakes. It sounds like something from a Hollywood epic, not ancient warfare. Yet this myth has slithered through history. claiming Carthage pioneered chemical warfare 2,000 years before mustard gas darkened World War I's battlefields. But how much of this serpentine strategy is fact, and how much is the exaggeration of awestruck historians? Start with the source. The snake story appears in writings about the Battle of the Eurymedon in 180 BC, where Hannibal supposedly defeated a Pergamene fleet using this bizarre tactic. But here's the twist: the earliest account comes from a Roman historian writing decades later, with no eyewitness corroboration. Ancient chroniclers loved dramatic flourishes, especially when describing Carthage's barbaric cunning. Compare this to verified siege tactics of the era. Cities routinely used heated sand, boiling oil, or even beehives as improvised weapons, snakes far less practical. Transporting lethal serpents in sufficient numbers to effect a battle would have been a logistical nightmare, not to mention the risk of them turning on their handlers. Yet there's a kernel of truth hiding in the grass. Carthage did employ psychological warfare masterfully. Their siege engines were often designed to terrify as much as destroy, from fireballs that screamed as they flew to ships rigged with hidden spikes. The snake myth might be a garbled retelling of real ingenuity, perhaps using smoke or noxious fumes to disorient foes, later embellished into something more exotic. The deeper question is why this legend persists, because it plays into Carthage's reputation as the ultimate, outside-the-box thinkers of antiquity. When your enemy paints you as a monster, why not lean into it? Whether or not the snake pots existed, the tale itself became a weapon proof that Carthage's brilliance on the battlefield bordered on the supernatural. Imagine a harbor so cunningly designed it could make an entire fleet vanish not by magic, but by sheer ingenuity. That's the legend that clung to Carthage's coastal fortress, whispered by enemies who claimed its naval base, disappeared behind walls, or even sank beneath the waves at will. But beneath the myth lies an even more fascinating truth, a masterpiece of ancient engineering that didn't need invisibility to awe the Mediterranean. At the heart of the tale were Carthage's dual harbors, a bustling commercial port open to the world, and a secretive, circular naval basin shielded from prying eyes. Roman historians like Appian describe this military harbor as a fortress within a fortress, its inner ring housing ship sheds for tuned vessels, hidden behind an island tower manned by the admiral. To outsiders it must have seemed like sorcery. Ships would enter the outer harbor, then vanish behind layered defenses, their numbers and readiness obscured. But here's where fact outshines fantasy. Recent underwater archaeology reveals the harbor wasn't invisible, it was just ahead of its time. The circular design wasn't about deception, it was about efficiency. Carthaginian engineers prioritized quick deployment, sheltering ships from storms and enemy spies alike. The disappearing act, likely a combination of staggered shifts, camouflaged roofs, and the simple advantage of controlling sightlines. Rome spun these innovations into myths of treachery, framing clever logistics as underhanded tricks. The real marvel was how Carthage's harbor doubled as a psychological weapon. Merchants docking at the open port would glimpse only fragments of the military's strength, enough to wonder what lurked unseen. That uncertainty was more powerful than any illusion. By the time Rome destroyed Carthage, they'd copied the circular harbor design themselves, proof that even the loudest critics couldn't resist borrowing from the genius they'd spent centuries vilifying. The idea of a curse sounds like something from a ghost story until you realize even the most practical Romans half believed it. When Rome finally crushed Carthage in 146 BCE, legend says the general Scipio Aemilianus wept as the city burned, quoting Homer's prophecy of Troy's fall and whispering a chilling warning, "One day, this will be Rome's fate too." Whether he actually said it hardly matters. The story stuck because it tapped into a deep anxiety that destroying a rival so utterly might invite cosmic payback. Later historians like Sallust and Plutarch spun this fear into a full-blown myth. Carthage's ashes carried a curse that festered for centuries, unraveling Rome from within. But curses don't need magic to work. Look at the Gracchi brothers, two reformers whose push for land redistribution ended in their bloody murders just decades after Carthage fell. Conservatives blamed their radical ideas on foreign corruption, a veiled nod to Carthaginian influence. Then came the civil wars, Marius versus Sulla, Caesar against Pompey, each conflict worse than the last. To Romans living through the chaos, it must have felt like Carthage's vengeance played out in real time. Even the soil seemed to revolt. Where Carthage once exported grain to feed the Republic, now Rome's own farms collapsed under debt and slave revolts, as if the land itself remembered who cultivated it first. Yet the truth was far more human. Rome's crisis wasn't supernatural, it was the inevitable result of unchecked expansion. Without Carthage as a rival, the Republic lost its balancing force. Greed replaced strategy, and conquest became an addiction. By the time Augustus declared empire, the old virtues Scipio mourned were already ghosts. Later Christian writers like Tertullian reveled in the irony. Rome's eternal city fell just as Carthage had, proving no empire escapes history's pendulum. The real curse wasn't in the ashes, it was in the mirror. The image is haunting, an ancient stone stele carved with a figure draped in a flowing robe, her outstretched arms flanked by curling serpents. This, some claim, is Tanit, Carthage's most revered goddess, worshipped not as a benevolent mother but as a divine serpent. The theory paints Carthage as a land of occult mysticism, its people bowing to a deity straight out of humanity's oldest nightmares. But dig deeper, and the truth coils into something far more complex than a simple tale of snake worship. Start with the evidence. Hundreds of Tanit stelae have been unearthed across Carthage's ruins, many bearing a symbol now called the Tanit sign, a triangle topped by a disc and horizontal arms. A few rare examples include serpent motifs, but they're outliers, not the norm. Compare this to neighboring cultures where serpent deities were explicit. The Egyptians had Wadjet, the cobra goddess of Lower Egypt, depicted with unmistakable reptilian features. The Canaanites worshipped the chaos serpent Lawton, direct ancestor of the biblical Leviathan. Tanit's iconography, by contrast, leans toward abstraction. Her serpents might represent rivers, fertility, or even the caduceus-like symbols of healing borrowed from Greek traders. Then there's the timing. The few serpent-linked stelae date to Carthage's later periods, suggesting foreign influence rather than deep-rooted tradition. As the city's empire expanded, so did its pantheon, absorbing elements from Berber, Greek, and Egyptian beliefs. A Phoenician goddess initially associated with the moon and harvest, slowly gathered new attributes, some perhaps borrowed from the Mesopotamian Ishtar, whose sacred snake symbolized rebirth. So why the persistent link to biblical monsters? Blame Victorian-era historians. Early archaeologists, steeped in Eurocentric bias, saw Carthage through the lens of Genesis, casting Tanit as a stand-in for Eden's temptress. Never mind that Carthaginian texts describe her as a protector of cities and contracts, often paired with Baal Hammon in blessings over marriage and commerce. The serpent myth fit a convenient narrative, Carthage as the other, a civilization so alien it must have trafficked in primal evils. The irony, Rome's own founding myth featured a she-wolf nursing twins, yet no one accused them of beast worship. Carthage's real transgression wasn't reverence for snakes, it was being different enough to spark the imagination, then powerless enough to let others define it. When you look at Tanit stelae today, you're not seeing a monster, you're seeing how history twists what it fears into something fantastical. Walk through the ruins of ancient Carthage at dusk, and you might hear locals whisper warnings about a shadowy figure clad in antique armor, Hannibal's ghost, forever pacing the hills where his empire once stood. This isn't just campfire storytelling, it's a living tradition blending history, nationalism, and collective memory into something far more potent than a mere ghost story. The legend takes shape in fragments, Fishermen near Cap Bon swear they've glimpsed a phantom general surveying the coastline where his fleet should have landed reinforcements. Tourists at Baal Hill report sudden chills near the old citadel walls, as if an unseen presence resents their footsteps, but the most striking accounts come from Tunisian resistance fighters during the French colonial era, who spoke of dreams where Hannibal urged them to outmaneuver their oppressors just as he'd outflanked Rome. How did a 2,000-year-old general become a spectral emblem of modern defiance? The answer lies in Tunisia's struggle for identity. When European archaeologists first excavated Carthage in the 19th century, they framed it as a lost civilization, disconnected from the Arab world. Tunisian intellectuals flipped the script. They resurrected Hannibal as a local hero, a strategic genius who'd humbled Europe long before colonialism began. By the 1930s, his name was spray-painted on anti-French protest signs, his face stamped on clandestine pamphlets calling for independence. The ghost stories gained traction because they served a purpose. Colonial officials dismissed them as superstition, missing their real power. To Tunisians, Hannibal wasn't just a ghost, he was proof their land had birthed conquerors long before it was conquered. Even today, schoolchildren learn his tactics alongside the exploits of modern revolutionaries, blurring the line between history and myth. Archaeologists might roll their eyes at tales of spectral armies, but they can't deny the magnetism of the legend. Visit the Antonine Baths at twilight, and you'll understand why. The ruins don't just whisper of the past, they hum with the uncanny energy of a story too defiant to die. Whether Hannibal's spirit truly walks these hills matters less than what his enduring presence represents, the unbroken thread between ancient glory and modern pride. Beneath the sun-baked streets of ancient Carthage, whispers persist of a shadow metropolis, an entire city under the city, where forgotten tunnels twist like roots beneath temples and markets. This myth taps into something primal, the allure of hidden worlds, of secrets buried just out of sight. Roman propagandists fueled the legend, claiming Carthaginians retreated into these labyrinths during their final defeat, plotting revenge from the underworld. But archaeology reveals a far more pragmatic truth, one that's almost as fascinating as the fiction. Start with the sewers. Carthage's drainage systems were engineering marvels, with vaulted channels wide enough to walk through, a rarity in the ancient Mediterranean. After Rome destroyed the city in 146 BCE, they rebuilt atop the ruins, repurposing these tunnels for water management. Over centuries, layers of construction piled up, creating the illusion of a sunken city beneath the new one. 19th-century explorers, stumbling upon these passages by lamplight, mistook them for proof of Carthage's legendary underworld. But why does the idea of an underground Carthage grip our imagination so tightly? Because it mirrors the civilization's own fate, crushed by Rome, yet never truly erased. Modern ground-penetrating radar surveys show extensive substructures, but they're warehouses, cisterns, and workshops, not some clandestine stronghold. The real underground Carthage was a logistical masterpiece, grain silos carved into bedrock to withstand sieges, secret aqueducts feeding the city during blockades. Here's the twist that keeps the myth alive: Carthage did have hidden spaces, just not the kind storytellers crave. The Tophet burial ground, the concealed naval harbor, these weren't shadows of a subterranean society, but proof of a culture that mastered the art of discretion. When every trading rival or enemy army sought your secrets, building some things out of sight became survival. Today, standing in the echoing tunnels beneath Baal Hill, you can almost hear the real story, not a city beneath the city, but the heartbeat of a civilization too ingenious to be forgotten. The legend endures because we want to believe some part of Carthage escaped Rome's wrath, that beneath the conqueror's boots, something untouched still waits. Archaeology may have stripped the mystery from those tunnels, but not their power. They remain a testament to the most human of truths. What's hidden often shapes history far more than what's seen. What if the New World wasn't so new after all? Among the wildest myths clinging to Carthage, is the claim their ships crossed the Atlantic long before Columbus centuries, even millennia earlier. Proponents point to cryptic carvings on the Bat Creek stone in Tennessee, scattered Phoenician-style inscriptions across Brazil, and even traces of Mediterranean DNA in indigenous populations. It's a tantalizing idea that history's greatest seafarers might have beaten Europe to the Americas, but peel back the layers, and you'll find a story less about ancient voyagers and more about how easily hope can outpace evidence. Start with the so-called proof, the Bat Creek stone, discovered in 1889 in a Native American burial mound, bears markings some insist are Paleo-Hebrew. If true, it would suggest Semitic visitors to North America over 1,000 years before Columbus, but there's a glaring problem. The stone's inscription is backward, as if someone copied a Hebrew text without understanding it. Modern analysis reveals the ancient artifact was likely a 19th-century hoax, possibly crafted by a Confederate doctor with a fascination for antiquities. Similar Phoenician relics across the Americas crumble under scrutiny: the Paraíba inscription in Brazil, a confessed forgery, the Las Lunas Decalogue stone in New Mexico. Its mix of alphabets from different eras screams fabrication. Then there's the genetic argument. Some studies claim to find Mediterranean markers in pre-Columbian South American skeletons, but these often confuse later European contact with ancient voyages. Carthaginians were master navigators. Yes, their ships routinely braved the Atlantic's eastern currents to reach Britain and West Africa, but crossing the ocean's full width. Even with their sturdiest vessels, surviving the journey would have required impossible luck. No Carthaginian pottery, tools, or settlement layers have ever surfaced in the Americas, despite centuries of searching. Contrast this with the Vikings, whose Newfoundland camp left unmistakable evidence: iron nails, distinct architecture, and sagas corroborated by archaeology. Here's what gets lost in the hype: Carthage's real maritime achievements are staggering enough without transatlantic myths. Their sailors used the pole star for navigation, mapped ocean currents centuries before modern science, and possibly circumnavigated Africa, a feat even Herodotus doubted. The irony: by chasing phantom connections to the Americas, we overlook the genuine brilliance of their documented voyages. The Atlantic wasn't a barrier Carthage needed to cross to prove its greatness. Its legacy rides not on fabricated stones, but on the waves of a sea it once called home. After Rome's legions reduced Carthage to smoldering ruins in 146 BCE, the victors hauled away treasures beyond counting: gold melted from temple ornaments, silver pried from city gates, jewels stripped from the dead. But as the spoils flowed into Rome, so did whispers. These riches carried a taint. Soldiers who pocketed sacred relics met gruesome ends. Senators who funded campaigns with Carthaginian gold saw their fortunes crumble. Even decades later, writers like Pliny the Elder muttered about Punic luck, the idea that ill-gotten gains from Carthage came with invisible strings attached. Was this ancient karma, or just a clever way for Rome to shame its own greed? The myth's roots twist deep into Roman psychology. Before the Third Punic War, conservative politicians like Cato the Elder framed Carthage's wealth as corrupting, a moral contagion threatening Rome's austere virtues. After the city fell, that rhetoric flipped. Suddenly, the same senators who demanded Carthage's destruction now warned that its plundered gold carried a curse, conveniently discouraging rivals from monopolizing the spoils. The parallels to Egypt's Curse of the Pharaohs are striking, but there's a key difference. While Tutankhamun's curse was a 20th century invention, Carthage's alleged curse emerged almost immediately, woven into Rome's own historical record. Archaeology adds a grim footnote: excavations at Carthage harbor uncovered lead curse tablets, thin sheets inscribed with prayers for divine vengeance against thieves. These weren't superstition, they were psychological warfare. Carthaginian priests likely hid them among treasures, knowing Romans would discover them and spread panic. The tactic worked. when General Scipio's fleet sank in a storm off Sicily, taking tons of loot to the seabed, gossip claimed the gods of Carthage had claimed their due. Yet the real curse wasn't supernatural, it was economic. Flooding Rome with Carthage's wealth destabilized its economy, devaluing currency and sparking inflation that lasted generations. The Senate's solution: blame the victims. By casting Carthaginian gold as accursed, they mask their own mismanagement. Even today, the legend lingers, a reminder that the darkest magic isn't found in relics, but in the stories we tell to justify our flaws. Virgil's Aeneid gives us one of antiquity's most haunting scenes: Queen Dido, betrayed by the wandering hero Aeneas, climbing her own funeral pyre as Carthage's flames mirror her despair. It's a masterpiece of poetry, but as history, it's pure fiction. The real founder of Carthage wasn't a lovelorn tragic figure but a political fugitive named Elissa, whose true story reveals how easily myth can rewrite reality for power's sake. Start with the facts. Tyrian records etched on temple walls tell of Princess Elissa, sister to King Pygmalion of Tyre, who fled Phoenicia after her brother murdered her husband for his wealth. This wasn't romance, it was a bloody coup. Elissa's escape with loyal nobles and a stolen royal treasury was less Aeneid and more Game of Thrones. When she bargained with North African Berbers for land, legend says she cut an ox hide into strips to encircle a hill, the cunning Biasa founding myth that later Romans twisted into wordplay, Greek bursa for hide. No suicidal passion, just shrewd diplomacy. So how did Elissa become Dido, the woman defined by her heartbreak? Blame Rome's culture wars. Virgil wrote the Aeneid under Augustus, who needed a founding myth to rival Greece's Iliad. Casting Carthage's founder as a spurned woman served two purposes: it painted Rome's archenemy as emotionally volatile, and it justified Aeneas abandoning her to fulfill his destiny founding Rome. The subtext was clear: Carthage's roots were passion and chaos, Rome's were duty and order, yet here's the fascinating twist: even Carthage itself leaned into the myth. Later rulers amplified Dido's story, recasting her suicide as a patriotic act of defiance against foreign exploitation. A single tale became propaganda for both sides: Rome's dismissal of female leadership and Carthage's rallying cry against colonial oppression. Archaeologists digging near Biasa Hill found coins minted centuries after Virgil, depicting Elissa Dido with a mix of royal dignity and tragic aura. History didn't just blur the line between Elissa and Dido, it erased it entirely to serve whoever held the pen. The real tragedy isn't Dido's fictional death, it's how a formidable political survivor was reduced to a love-struck footnote. Elissa didn't just secure land, she negotiated with armed Berber tribes while outnumbered, established trade pacts that underwrote Carthage's future empire, and likely ruled for decades. Compare that to Virgil's Dido, who exists only to weep and burn. 2,000 years later, her story reminds us that history isn't just written by the victors, it's rewritten by the poets. The question of Carthage's ethnic identity is one of history's most loaded debates, a tangle of archaeology, politics, and modern agendas. Some Afrocentric scholars argue vehemently that Carthaginians were black Africans, while traditional Eurocentric narratives cast them as lighter-skinned Phoenician transplants. But the truth defies these simplistic boxes. Carthage wasn't a monolith, it was a whirlwind of cultures, a Mediterranean crossroads where Berber, Levantine, Greek, and indigenous African influences collided and blended. Start with the genetics. Recent DNA analysis of Punic remains from Carthaginian cemeteries reveals a mosaic. Some burials show clear Levantine ancestry, linking them to Phoenician settlers from modern-day Lebanon. Others carry North African Berber markers, evidence of intermarriage with local populations. A few graves even show sub-Saharan African ancestry, likely from trade connections reaching deep into the continent. This wasn't a black or white civilization, it was a mercantile empire where identity hinged more on citizenship and commerce than skin tone. Then there's the art. Carthaginian mosaics and sculptures depict people with a range of features, curly-haired figures with darker complexions, alongside aquiline-nosed traders in Greek tunics. Their coins tell the same story. Some show Tanit with African braids, others with the almond-eyed elegance of Near Eastern goddesses. Even their language hints at this fusion. While Punic was a Semitic tongue closely related to Hebrew, inscriptions found in Algeria and Libya include Berber loanwords and names. Why does this myth persist? Because modern identity wars crave clear-cut heroes and villains, Afrocentric advocates, rightly pushing back against histories that erase Africa's global influence, sometimes overcorrect by claiming Carthage as exclusively black. Meanwhile, colonial-era historians downplayed African ties to position Carthage as a civilized outlier in a barbaric continent. Both sides miss the point. Carthage thrived precisely because it refused to fit neatly into any one category. Its power came from bridging worlds, not belonging to just one. The real tragedy isn't the debate over Carthage's racial identity, but how that debate flattens a vibrant, complex society into a checkbox. Walk through the ruins of Carthage today, and you're not standing in a black city or a white city. You're standing in the shadow of history's first true globalization experiment, a place where what you traded mattered far more than the shade of your skin. Poisoned wine, it's the ultimate betrayal, a weapon that turns hospitality into horror. Ancient historians like Polybius and Livy spun tales of Carthaginians spiking their enemies' drinks with lethal herbs, painting them as masters of underhanded warfare. The most infamous account comes from the Mercenary War in the 3rd century BC, when rebellious troops supposedly dropped dead after celebrating with tainted wine gifted by Carthaginian negotiators. It's a story tailor-made to villainize a rival, but how much of it holds up under scrutiny? Start with the logistics. Poisoning an entire army's wine supply would require staggering quantities of toxins and knowledge of exactly when and where enemies would drink. Yet Carthage's botanical expertise wasn't fictional. Their physicians traded with Egyptian and Greek healers, compiling extensive knowledge of local plants like deadly oleander or hemlock, like species native to North Africa. The same merchants who shipped spices and dyes could have smuggled poisons, but here's the catch: mass poisoning leaves evidence. Archaeology hasn't turned up mass graves from the Mercenary War with telltale residues in the bones, nor do contemporary accounts describe symptoms matching known regional toxins. Then there's the Roman lens. Every recorded instance of Carthaginian poison comes from Roman or pro-Roman sources, the same writers who accuse them of child sacrifice and piracy. The pattern's too convenient. Carthage loses a battle, they're weak. Carthage wins, they must have cheated. Poison narratives let Rome frame their foes as dishonorable, justifying their own brutality. Compare this to Rome's own tactics, burying rivals under avalanches of lawsuits or quietly eliminating prisoners. Different methods, same ruthlessness, but only Carthage got branded as treacherous. The myth persists because it taps into primal fears. Sharing wine symbolized trust in antiquity. Violating that trust struck at the heart of social order. Even if Carthage never poisoned a single amphora, the legend endures as a warning: beware the enemy who smiles as they pour. Beneath the drama lies a grain of truth: Carthage didn't need poison to be formidable. Their real weapon was perception, the art of making rivals fear what might be lurking in the shadows, and sometimes the threat alone is enough. The legend of Carthage's walls looms as large as the fortifications themselves, a triple-layered monstrosity said to repel armies like waves crashing against cliffs. Ancient writers like Appian breathlessly described them: outer ramparts thick enough to stable war elephants, middle barriers studded with watchtowers, inner walls so high they blotted out the sun. To enemies, these defenses weren't just stone and mortar, they were psychological warfare, a physical manifestation of Carthage's arrogance. But when Rome's legions finally shattered them in 146 BC, the myth of invincibility crumbled too. revealing the sobering truth behind history's most exaggerated fortifications. Start with the architecture. Carthage's triple wall system wasn't unique. Tyrian ancestors had built similar bastions in Phoenicia. What set Carthage's defenses apart was scale. The outer wall stretched over 20 miles, wrapped around the entire city and its sprawling suburbs. Ancient sources claim it rose 45 feet high, twice the height of Rome's Servian walls, with barracks and stables built directly into its structure, allowing rapid troop movements. The middle wall, likely added after the First Punic War, featured a moat and staggered gates designed to funnel attackers into kill zones, but the innermost wall was the masterpiece, a sheer curtain of limestone blocks anchored to Biasa Hill, its foundations wide enough to drive chariots along the ramparts. Yet these marvels had fatal flaws. Scipio Aemilianus didn't overpower the walls, he outthought them. Roman sappers exploited a critical weakness, Carthage's coastline. While landward walls stood impregnable, the seaward defenses were thinner, relying on the navy to repel attacks. When Rome blockaded the harbor, they created a beachhead near the quays, tunneling beneath the impenetrable walls where mortar had eroded from salt spray. Contemporary accounts describe Carthaginian defenders dumping burning debris into the tunnels, only for Romans to counter with wet hides and relentless battering rams. The real breach came not from brute force, but from Carthage's own complacency. They'd assumed no enemy could sustain a siege long enough to test their walls' limits. The myth's persistence speaks volumes. For centuries afterward, Roman generals pointed to Carthage's fall as proof that no walls could withstand Rome's destiny. But here's what they glossed over: it took 3 years of starvation, betrayal, and near disaster before those walls yielded. The truth wasn't that Carthage's defenses failed, it's that they held long enough to expose Rome's own fragility. When Byzantium later modeled its legendary walls on Carthage's blueprints, the architects understood what mythmakers missed. True strength isn't about being unbreakable, but about forcing your enemy to break themselves against you. The accusation is enough to make your skin crawl that Carthaginians didn't just sacrifice children, but consumed their flesh in unholy rites. Roman historians like Plutarch described banquets where priests devoured human remains, painting Carthage as a civilization steeped in barbaric hunger. These tales weren't just gossip, they were psychological warfare, designed to strip Carthage of its humanity. But when you sift through the grisly claims and examine actual Carthaginian practices, a starkly different picture emerges, one of cultural rituals twisted beyond recognition by the lens of hatred. Start with the source of the slur. The cannibalism myth peaks in accounts of the mercenary war, when unpaid rebel troops allegedly discovered jars of preserved human flesh in Carthaginian storehouses. It's a detail so lurid it feels ripped from a horror story because it probably was. No physical evidence supports this claim, and Carthage's own records, preserved on funeral stelae and temple inventories, detail strict purity laws around food. Offerings to Baal Hammon included grain, wine, and livestock, with explicit taboos against consuming blood or unclean animals. Compare this to Rome's own history. During the siege of Numantia, Roman soldiers resorted to cannibalism out of desperation, a fact their historians quickly glossed over. Archaeology adds another layer of doubt. Excavations at Carthaginian settlements reveal meticulous kitchens with separate vessels for meat and dairy, echoing Levantine dietary customs. Their butchery practices show precision cuts for ceremonial roasting, not the haphazard hacking you'd expect from ritualistic feasting on human remains. Even their garbage pits tell a story filled with fish bones, olive pits, and charred grains, but nothing resembling the gore described by Roman propagandists. So why did the myth stick? Because dehumanization is a timeless tactic. By framing Carthaginians as eaters of flesh, Rome justified its own atrocities: enslavement, mass executions, the literal salting of Carthage's earth. The irony is crushing. A culture that meticulously tracked every shekel of temple donations and penned contracts in triplicate was recast as a horde of ravenous monsters. The truth lies in the quiet details. Carthaginian funeral inscriptions speak of returning to the earth with dignity, of ashes resting in sanctified ground. Their laws punished even minor thefts from graves. This wasn't a people who feasted on the dead, it was a society that revered the line between sacred and profane. The real horror isn't in ancient rituals, it's how easily lies can fossilize into history when the winners hold the chisel. Every empire thrives on secrets, but Carthage's alleged spy network wasn't just skilled, according to Roman historians. It was supernatural. Livy spins wild tales of Hannibal's agents disguised as merchants and slaves, infiltrating the highest circles of Roman power, even slipping poison into senators' wine. One particularly colorful account claims a Carthaginian spy hid coded messages inside hollow dog collars, while another describes Hannibal receiving battlefield updates via carrier pigeons trained to outfly Roman hawks. These stories paint Carthage as a shadow empire, pulling Rome's strings like a puppeteer, but separate fact from fiction, and you'll find something far more fascinating than Hollywood-worthy espionage, a real-world intelligence operation that was groundbreaking for its time, yet far from omnipotent. Start with the verifiable tactics. Carthage did pioneer early forms of encrypted communication, though not with fantastical hollow collars. Excavations near Capua revealed lead tablets inscribed with Punic shorthand, likely merchant ledgers doubling as coded troop movements. Their trade networks provided perfect cover. A Phoenician sailor docking in Syracuse or Neapolis wouldn't raise eyebrows while sketching harbor layouts. A wine merchant noting legion sizes could blame it on inventory counts. Hannibal's march through the Alps was almost certainly guided by Celtic informants, paid in silver to reveal mountain passes. These weren't cinematic super spies, but pragmatic partnerships exploiting Rome's weakest link, its assumption that barbarians couldn't organize. Yet Livy's accounts tip into paranoid fantasy. He alleges Carthaginian spies orchestrated everything from the defection of Roman allies to the sudden deaths of consuls. Never mind that Rome itself was masterful at subversion, bribing Gallic chieftains to betray Hannibal, or planting rumors to turn Sicilian cities against Carthage. The double standard reeks of projection. By casting Carthage as all-seeing manipulators, Rome could explain away its own failures. If a battle was lost, it wasn't due to poor strategy, but enemy trickery. The truth lies in the gaps. Carthage's real advantage wasn't some vast underground network, but cultural fluidity. Their agents blended in because they genuinely belonged to multiple worlds, half Punic, half Greek translators in Sicily, Berber-speaking caravan guides who knew every desert oasis. Unlike Rome's rigid hierarchy, Carthage empowered low-status brokers, sailors, scribes, and even enslaved tutors placed in aristocratic households. No mythical pigeons were needed when a fisherman could row news past blockades under cover of night. What makes this myth endure isn't its accuracy, but its uncomfortable echo. Rome's terror of Carthaginian spies reveals a deeper insecurity, that their enemy understood them better than they understood themselves. When Livy describes Hannibal anticipating every Roman move, he's admitting, unwillingly, that Carthage's greatest weapon wasn't secrecy, but empathy. The real conspiracy, that history's losers might have been smarter than the winners dared to confess. The Mediterranean night burns bright in one of antiquity's most persistent legends, Carthaginian warships cloaked in eerie, invisible flames, their hulls untouched by fire yet reducing enemy fleets to ash. Medieval scribes spun tales of a secret weapon called Punic fire, a liquid doom that clung to Roman sails like cursed oil. But dig through the embers of these stories, and you'll find a far simpler truth: history's habit of turning mundane ingenuity into mythic terror. Start with the kernel of fact. Carthage's naval dominance wasn't magic, it was chemistry. Shipwrights in their harbors waterproofed hulls with heated pine pitch, a common practice that gave the wood a dark, glossy sheen. When Greek traders first saw these vessels under the setting sun, The reflective tar might have shimmered like some unearthly aura. Combine this with accounts of Carthage's fire arrows, bundles of oil-soaked flax lit and launched onto enemy decks, and the myth begins to take shape. By the time Roman poets got hold of the idea, practical naval tactics had morphed into legends of invincible ghost ships. The real twist comes from Carthage's enemies. Centuries later, Byzantine inventors created Greek fire, a napalm-like substance that burned even on water. Medieval historians, conflating timelines, retroactively gifted this horror to Carthage, as if every Mediterranean power needed its own superweapon. A 10th century Arab chronicler's account of ships that spat fire like dragons was misattributed to Hannibal's fleet, despite being written 1,000 years after Carthage fell. Archaeology adds the final clue. Excavated Carthaginian naval bases show workshops stockpiling sulfur and quicklime ingredients for smoke screens, not flamethrowers. Their tactics relied on maneuverability, not pyrotechnics. When Roman ships floundered in battle, it wasn't phantom fire that doomed them, but superior Punic seamanship. The legend endures because we crave drama in history's dry pages, but sometimes the most formidable weapons aren't fantastical inventions, just ordinary mastery wielded extraordinarily well. The image is horrifying: a giant bronze bull, its hollow belly glowing red-hot as victims scream inside, their agonized cries transformed into animalistic bellows by cleverly designed pipes. Greek and Roman historians swore this gruesome execution device, the infamous brazen bull of Sicily, was a tribute to Carthage's chief god, Baal Hammon. They painted him as a bloodthirsty deity demanding human suffering, his cult spreading terror across the Mediterranean. But peel back the layers of propaganda, and you'll find a striking disconnect between myth and reality, a case of deliberate cultural slander that distorted a harvest god into a monster. Start with the facts. Baal Hammon's earliest depictions in Carthage show him enthroned, holding a staff of wheat, often flanked by rams, a far cry from the fire-breathing tyrant of Roman nightmares. Inscriptions from Carthaginian temples describe him as a provider of rains and abundant crops, his name possibly linked to the Semitic word for warmth, referring to the sun's life-giving heat. Farmers worshipped him for fertile fields, merchants for safe voyages under his celestial guidance. Even the infamous Tophet burial grounds, often cited as proof of his cruelty, contain more dedications to Baal Hammon for healthy children than any reference to sacrifice. So how did a god of agriculture become the poster child for barbarism? Blame the Greek colony of Acragas in Sicily. When the tyrant Phalaris commissioned the brazen bull in the 6th century BC, he claimed inspiration from foreign rites, a vague nod to Carthaginian traders in the region. Centuries later, Roman writers like Diodorus fused the bull's legend with Baal Hammon's iconography. Despite one glaring inconsistency, Carthage's own artwork never depicts their god with bulls. Rams, yes, symbols of vitality and leadership across Phoenician culture, but the bull was a Greek and Cretan motif, tied to myths like the Minotaur. The conflation was as deliberate as it was dishonest. Archaeology seals the case. Excavations at Carthage harbors uncovered small household altars where families left offerings of grain and wine to Baal Hammon, sometimes with tiny clay ram figurines. Contrast this with Roman accounts of smoking bull idols, and you see the pattern. Carthage's enemies took a single gruesome artifact from a Greek tyrant and grafted it onto an entire religion to justify conquest. The real Baal Hammon wasn't a god of torture, he was a deity of survival, venerated by a civilization that knew the Mediterranean's fickle climate could mean feast or famine. The irony: Rome's own gods demanded blood. Gladiatorial games, originally funeral rites, became spectacles of slaughter in honor of Jupiter and Mars. Yet no one framed Rome's pantheon as inherently savage. The brazen bull myth endures because it simplifies history's complexities into a morality play: civilized Romans versus monstrous Carthaginians. But dig deeper, and the truth emerges. The molten bull wasn't a Carthaginian symbol, it was a mirror, reflecting the brutality of those who wielded the story as a weapon. The idea seems ripped straight from a steampunk fantasy, Carthaginian soldiers lining the battlements, angling polished bronze shields to focus sunlight into a searing beam that ignites enemy ships like kindling. It's a story that feels eerily familiar, echoed in legends of Archimedes' supposed death ray at Syracuse. But here's the twist: while Archimedes' mirror weapon is debated by historians, Carthage's version is pure myth, a case of mistaken identity and exaggerated reputation snowballing across centuries. The myth's roots tangle in two key threads. First, Carthage's real mastery of siege engineering. Ancient sources describe their use of reflective surfaces not as weapons, but as signaling devices. Polished bronze sheets could flash coded messages across vast distances, coordinating troop movements or warning of approaching fleets. To an enemy watching from a distance, these rapid bursts of light might resemble concentrated fire. Second, their innovations in naval warfare. Carthaginian ships often mounted rotating platforms with iron cages holding flaming pitch, which could be swung onto enemy decks, a far cry from laser-like beams, but terrifying enough to inspire tall tales. By the Middle Ages, Arab scholars like al-Masudi compounded the confusion. Writing about Carthage's mechanical wonders, they blended fact with folklore, describing burning mirrors alongside real inventions like water clocks and siege towers. The irony: these accounts were likely referencing Greek and Roman siege engines captured by Carthage, not homegrown superweapons. A 12th century Persian manuscript even mistakenly attributed Archimedes' already dubious mirror device to Carthaginian engineers, merging two distinct civilizations into one legendary techno-empire. Archaeology exposes the myth's flimsy foundation. Excavations at Carthage's naval yards reveal workshops crammed with pulley systems and grappling hooks, but no trace of the precision-cast parabolic mirrors needed for a death ray. Physics seals the deal. Tests by MIT engineers proved that even with perfect alignment, ancient bronze reflectors couldn't generate the heat required to combust wood at sea distances. The real marvel wasn't imaginary rays, but Carthage's psychological edge, letting enemies believe they wielded the sun itself. Why does this myth endure? Because it transforms ingenuity into magic. Carthage's true brilliance lay in adaptation, not invention. They repurposed Greek fire siphons, improved Egyptian crane designs, and scaled up Phoenician signaling methods. But in the human imagination, competence often balloons into the supernatural. The mirror death ray wasn't historical fact, it was the ancient world's version of a viral rumor, proof that even back then, people couldn't resist a good sci-fi story. Could a single act of destruction alter the very skies above? Some fringe theories claim Rome's annihilation of Carthage didn't just topple an empire, it triggered a climate catastrophe. According to these sensational stories, the fires burning for 17 days after the city's fall released so much smoke and ash, they blotted out the sun, plunging North Africa into a mini ice age. It's a dramatic tale that taps into modern fears of ecological collapse, but the science tells a far different story, one where human consequences outweigh atmospheric ones. Start with the atmospheric myth. For Carthage's burning to cause global cooling, it would have needed to rival volcanic eruptions like Mount Tambora in 1815, which spewed enough sulfur dioxide to drop global temperatures for years. Carthage's destruction, while devastating, simply didn't have the scale. Modern climate models estimate the event released less than 1% of the particulates needed to disrupt weather patterns regionally, let alone globally. Even the famed 17 days of fire was likely hyperbole. Archaeological evidence shows concentrated burning in the civic center, not the entire city. But here's where the myth obscures a darker truth. Carthage's fall didn't change the climate, it changed the land. Before Rome's victory, Carthaginian farmers had mastered dry land agriculture, building terraces and cisterns to trap scarce rainwater. Their famed Punic wheat required minimal irrigation, thriving where other crops failed. When Rome redistributed these lands to senators, the new owners ripped out the drought-resistant crops, replacing them with thirsty olive groves for export. Within decades, soil erosion and deforestation turned vast tracts of Tunisia's breadbasket into dust. Pliny the Elder later noted the once fertile Bagradas Valley produced less grain than it had under Carthaginian rule, a silent indictment of short-sighted conquest. The climate change myth persists because it reflects our own anxieties. In an era of wildfires and rising temperatures, we project our fears onto the past, imagining ancient parallels to today's crises. But Carthage's real lesson isn't about atmospheric science, it's about how empires prioritize profit over sustainability. Rome didn't need to darken the skies to cripple North Africa's ecology. They just needed to ignore the wisdom of those who'd lived there first. The land remembered what the conquerors forgot. Whispers cling to the fragments of Carthage language like curses etched in lead, the idea that Punic script wasn't just a tool for trade, but a channel for supernatural forces. Medieval mystics claimed its angular letters could summon demons. Renaissance occultists insisted its alphabet held the true name of God, hidden from Hebrew and Greek. Even today, fringe theorists argue that Carthaginian merchants scribbled not just prices, but spells, their ink laced with the power to sink ships or sour wine. But strip away the esoteric fantasies, and you'll find a language that shaped empires not through magic, but through sheer practicality. Punic was the duct tape of the ancient Mediterranean, a linguistic adhesive binding ports from Cadiz to Cyprus. Derived from Phoenician, its letters were optimized for speed, carved into wax tablets or painted on amphorae with swift, economical strokes. This wasn't the ornate calligraphy of Egyptian hieroglyphs or the ceremonial flourish of Latin inscriptions. Punic thrived in dockside taverns and market stalls, where a misplaced stroke could mean the difference between profit and ruin. Archaeologists have uncovered thousands of mundane examples: invoices for olive oil, slave manifests, even a cheeky graffiti duel between two rival fishmongers in a Sardinian outpost. Yet the myth of its occult power persists for reasons deeper than superstition. When Rome systematically erased Punic from public life after Carthage's fall, they didn't just ban a language, they created an aura of forbidden knowledge. Later cultures, stumbling upon cryptic Punic inscriptions in North African ruins, assumed they'd found relics of some arcane art. The infamous curse tablets from Carthage harbors fueled this fire. These thin lead sheets, inscribed with prayers for divine vengeance against thieves, were standard legal practice. Think ancient restraining orders with a religious twist. But to medieval monks transcribing them centuries later, the unfamiliar script seemed to thrum with malevolent energy. Kabbalists added another layer. In the 12th century, Jewish scholars in Iberia mistook Punic similarities to Hebrew for a lost tongue of Solomon, weaving it into mystical traditions. A single misread glyph could spawn entire treatises on angelic hierarchies, never mind that native Punic speakers had used the same letters to haggle over pottery prices. The allure of the unknown transformed accounting shorthand into celestial code. The real magic of Punic wasn't in imagined incantations, but in its endurance. Long after Rome declared victory, the language survived in mountain villages and coastal enclaves, adapting into Neo-Punic dialects that resisted imperial homogenization. A 5th-century Christian bishop in Algeria still preached in Punic. Berber nomads wove its vocabulary into their own tongues. That's the untold irony. Rome feared Carthage's language as a vessel for curses, when its true power lay in persistence, a whispered rebellion against oblivion. The story sounds like the ultimate irony that Rome, the city that obliterated Carthage, might owe its very origins to a Carthaginian princess. Virgil's Aeneid spins this tale with poetic grandeur. The Trojan hero Aeneas, fleeing the ashes of his homeland, finds refuge in Carthage, only to break Queen Dido's heart before sailing on to found Rome. It's a narrative so rich with symbolism, you'd almost forget it was crafted centuries after the fact to serve a very modern agenda, but beneath the epic's polished verses lies a web of political maneuvering, cultural appropriation, and the deliberate reshaping of history to fit an empire's needs. Start with the timeline. The Aeneid was written between 29 and 19 BC, commissioned by Emperor Augustus to give Rome a mythic pedigree worthy of its newfound imperial glory. Prior to this, Rome's founding myths were messy, local affairs, stories of wolf-suckled twins and stolen Sabine women, but as Augustus consolidated power, he needed something grander, a divine lineage linking Rome to the legendary heroes of Troy, while simultaneously framing Carthage as the tragic foil. Enter Aeneas, the perfect bridge. By making him abandon Dido, Virgil's poem performed two political miracles at once. It painted Carthage as a civilization undone by passion, Dido's suicidal despair contrasting with Aeneas' stoic duty, while positioning Rome's destiny as inexorable, a divine mandate that justified its domination of the Mediterranean. The Carthaginian connection wasn't incidental, it was strategic. Augustus' Rome was fresh from civil wars, its identity fractured. By weaving Carthage into the mythos, Virgil gave Romans a shared enemy from the start, a primal other against which to define themselves. The irony, Carthage's own founding myth Ilyssus' flight from Tyre, was repurposed as Dido's backstory, stripping the historical queen of her agency as a political leader and reducing her to a lovelorn obstacle in Rome's path. Archaeology adds a piercing footnote. While Virgil's Dido is pure fiction, Carthaginian records confirm trade and cultural exchange with early Rome long before the Punic Wars. Pottery shards and inscriptions suggest a far more nuanced relationship than the Aeneid allows, one of mutual influence, not primordial hatred. The real scandal isn't that Rome borrowed from Carthage's myths, but that it rewrote them to erase any hint of kinship. Why does this myth still resonate? Because it exposes how empires weaponize storytelling. Augustus didn't just want a founding myth, he wanted a propaganda tool. By grafting Rome's origins onto Carthage's narrative, he made Rome's eventual destruction of the city feel like fate, not genocide. The Aeneid wasn't poetry, it was psychological warfare, a reminder that history belongs not to those who live it, but to those who spin it best. And in that, Carthage never stood a chance. The image is striking. A clay coffin shaped like a human figure, arms crossed in eternal repose, its painted face gazing blankly through the centuries. At first glance, you might mistake it for an Egyptian sarcophagus, another relic of the obsession with preserving the dead, but this is Carthage, where burial customs followed a path all their own, blending Phoenician tradition with fleeting glimpses of Egyptian influence. The myth that Carthaginians mummified their dead like their Nile Valley counterparts is half-truth wrapped in cultural cross-pollination, a story that reveals more about ancient trade networks than any shared obsession with the afterlife. Start with the evidence. While Egyptian mummies were meticulously disemboweled, dehydrated with natron salts, and swaddled in linen, Carthaginian burials were far simpler. Their signature anthropoid coffins, sarcophagi shaped like human forms, were more artistic tribute than preservation tool. Excavations at Carthage's burial sites show skeletons inside these jars bearing no signs of embalming. The dead were often laid to rest with personal belongings, from bronze mirrors to childhood toys, suggesting a focus on accompanying spirits rather than physical permanence. The few exceptions prove the rule. Rare elite graves near Carthage harbors contain traces of resin-coated bandages, likely imported luxury treatments for wealthy merchants who'd traded with Egypt. The distinction speaks volumes. Egyptian mummification was a sacred science, tied to the belief that the body must remain intact for the soul's journey through the Jewat. Carthaginian practices, by contrast, echoed their Phoenician ancestors' pragmatism. At the colony of Hadrumetum, Archaeologists found bodies buried in simple pits with a single coin payment for charon, borrowed from Greek settlers. In Sardinia, Carthaginian tombs mingled with local nuragic traditions, their dead interred in communal caves. This wasn't a civilization fixated on individual immortality, but one adapting death rites to wherever its ships made port. Yet the myth persists because of those haunting anthropoid coffins. The finest examples, like the 5th century BCE sarcophagus now in Tunisia's Bardo Museum, show Egyptian stylistic touches, lotus motifs, faux beards reminiscent of Osiris. But look closer, the faces are unmistakably Punic, with fuller lips and curly beards absent from Nile Valley art. These weren't slavish copies, but creative hybrids, the work of local artisans catering to clients who wanted a dash of exotic prestige. Even the famed Mask of Tanit, a gold funerary plaque found near Carthage, blends Egyptian winged sun discs with distinctly Carthaginian symbols. The real story isn't about mummification, it's about marketing. Carthage's elite used Egyptian-esque burial goods the way modern billionaires might flaunt Swiss watches, as proof of global connections. A resin-sealed shroud wasn't about ensuring resurrection, it was a flex, a way to stand out in death as in life. Meanwhile, ordinary Carthaginians rested in simple urns or rock-cut tombs, their remains left to the earth. Archaeology offers the final twist. Recent chemical analysis of those elite resin bandages revealed something startling. They contained pine tar, not the myrrh and frankincense of true Egyptian embalming. Carthage's version was a budget knockoff, a telling detail for a culture that prized commerce over ceremony. The Egyptians built pyramids to cheat death. The Carthaginians built trade networks, trusting their legacy to the waves, not the underworld. In the end, their coffins weren't time capsules, they were mirrors, reflecting a society that sailed between worlds, even in death. Some conspiracy theories don't just bend the truth, they detonate it. Among the wildest modern myths about Carthage is the claim its ruins are radioactive, the smoking gun of an ancient nuclear war that wiped the city off the map. Proponents point to Geiger counter readings near the Tophet burial grounds and whisper about vitrified stones as proof of atomic blast temperatures. It's a story that feels ripped from a dystopian sci-fi novel, but dig into the science, and you'll find something far more mundane and far more fascinating than ancient Armageddon. Start with those radiation spikes. Certain areas around Carthage do show elevated readings, but the culprit isn't some lost doomsday weapon, it's geology. Tunisia's soil is naturally rich in phosphate deposits, which often contain trace amounts of uranium. When archaeologists first swept the Tophet with Geiger counters in the 1970s, they weren't uncovering evidence of a nuclear attack, they were detecting the same background radiation found in fertilizer mines worldwide. Even the so-called vitrified stones rocks with a glassy surface have a simple explanation. Carthage's final destruction involved weeks of uncontrolled fires, with temperatures hot enough to melt limestone into slag under specific conditions. Similar phenomena occur in modern kilns and foundries, no atom bombs required. The myth's persistence reveals a deeper tension between archaeology and pop culture. Ancient astronaut theorists and fringe historians often exploit the public's limited exposure to scientific fieldwork. When a researcher mentions anomalous readings, it's code for we need to investigate further, not aliens or superweapons. But in the age of viral headlines, nuance gets vaporized. A 2004 documentary clip showing a Japanese team taking radiation measurements near Carthage's ports was later edited to omit their conclusion that the levels were harmless and matched natural uranium decay patterns. Here's what gets buried beneath the hype. Carthage's real destruction was horrific enough without radioactivity. Roman accounts describe soldiers tearing the city apart stone by stone, plowing salt into the earth as a symbolic curse. The fires burned so intensely that archaeologists still find layers of ash fused with molten metal in the ruins. If you want evidence of a civilization erased, It's there in the rubble, no cosmic conspiracy needed. The irony, this myth does to Carthage's memory exactly what Rome did millennia ago, obliterates its humanity beneath layers of sensationalism. By turning its fall into a sci-fi spectacle, we risk forgetting the tangible lessons in those ruins about imperial overreach, cultural erasure, and how easily history gets rewritten. The truth isn't in Geiger counters or viral videos. It's in the quiet, unglamorous work of scholars sifting through soil, separating fact from fallout one shard at a time. From child sacrifices that might have been misunderstood funerary rites to phantom fleets armed with mythical superweapons, Carthage's myths form a tapestry of half-truths and deliberate distortions. What makes these stories so enduring isn't just their shock value, it's the way they refract the anxieties of the civilizations that told them. Rome didn't just conquer Carthage, they rewrote it, transforming a sophisticated trading empire into a boogeyman to justify their own brutality. Every accusation, piracy, poison, cannibalism says less about Carthaginian reality and more about Rome's need to paint its rival as monstrous. Even the wildest tales, like radioactive ruins or transatlantic voyages, reveal our modern obsession with lost technologies and hidden histories. But here's the twist: buried beneath the layers of legend are glimmers of Carthage's true genius. Their harbor wasn't invisible, but its ingenious design was so ahead of its time that enemies spun it into sorcery. Hannibal's elephants weren't supernatural war machines, but their psychological impact was so profound that Rome exaggerated their numbers for centuries. The real Carthage wasn't a civilization of villains or wizards, it was a society that thrived on adaptability, blending cultures and technologies in ways that unnerved its rivals. Their greatest crime, in the eyes of history, was simply being different enough to defy easy understanding. So why does Carthage still captivate us? Because its myths are mirrors. They reflect Rome's insecurities, medieval Europe's hunger for the exotic, and our own modern fascination with conspiracy and lost knowledge. The gaps in Carthage's story invite us to project our fears and fantasies onto its ruins. But every archaeological discovery, every scrap of Punic script deciphered, every harbor stone mapped pulls back the curtain on a people far more complex than the legends allowed. Now it's your turn. Which myth shook you the most? The brazen bull that wasn't, the ghostly ships that never burned, or something else entirely? Drop your thoughts in the comments. We're as obsessed with these mysteries as you are. And if you're hungry for more deep dives into history's shadowy corners, hit that subscribe button. The past is full of stories waiting to be unraveled, and we're just getting started.